My husband ended our marriage with a text that said, "I'm leaving you. I'm moving to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I already cleared out our joint bank account." Haha. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just replied, "Good luck." By the time he figured out what I had already set in motion, it was far too late to fix anything. Gemini said the vibration of my phone against the glass countertop sounded like a small explosion in the quiet of my boutique, a sharp, jagged noise that seemed to fracture the very air. I didn't know as I reached for it that the person I had shared a bed with for 15 years had just calculated the exact velocity required to vaporize my life. The blue light of the screen illuminated a betrayal so clinical and cold it felt like a physical touch of ice against my skin. "I'm leaving you and moving to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I've already emptied our joint account." My hands didn't shake as I read it, a strange, crystalline calm settling over me that felt less like peace and more like armor. My voice didn't waver a second later as I turned back to Mrs. Peterson, offering her a practiced, warm smile while helping her pick out a hand-painted silk scarf that matched her eyes. The only outward sign that my husband had just nuked our marriage via text was a microscopic tightening around the corners of my eyes, a fleeting tension that vanished before it could be categorized as grief. I waited until Mrs. Peterson's purchase was tucked safely inside our signature silver tissue paper, the ribbon curled into a perfect spiral, before I walked to the back of the shop. I stood there for a long moment, the scent of expensive candles and high-end leather surrounding me, and typed a two-word response that I knew would infuriate him more than 1,000 tearful pleas: "Good luck." My name is Claire, and at 38, I had just received what was arguably the most callous goodbye in the history of modern romance. But while Mark was likely at that very moment gloating over his grand exit, probably preening in a mirror and imagining me collapsed on the boutique floor in a heap of shattered expectations, I was calmly turning the deadbolt on the front door. The truth was, the signs hadn't just been there, they had been screaming at me for months in a language I had forced myself to learn. I'd watched the late nights at work that never resulted in a larger commission check, the sudden, frantic password changes on a phone he used to leave face up on the charger, and the desperate, pathetic way he'd started going to the gym religiously. Buying clothes 3 sizes too small to try and recapture a youth that had long since evaporated. 3 months ago, the shadow of a doubt had become a mountain of evidence. I had found a crumpled receipt in his coat pocket for a dinner for 2 at a restaurant we could never afford to go to on my birthday, dated a night he claimed to be pulling an all-nighter at the office. That same evening, I hadn't cried, I had opened a laptop. I'd established a separate bank account at a completely different institution, one he didn't even know existed. A week later, when he'd mentioned, with a suspiciously casual tone, that we should simplify things by fully combining our remaining separate assets into the joint account, I'd agreed cheerfully. I played the part of the trusting, distracted wife perfectly, all while moving my personal savings, my inheritance, and my business profits into the dark. The joint account he'd just emptied with such villainous glee? It contained exactly enough to keep him from getting suspicious, about 2 months' worth of regular household deposits. The rest of our life's work was safely tucked away under my thumb, along with a digital folder containing detailed records of every suspicious transaction, every unexplained hotel stay, and every lie he'd told over the past year. My phone buzzed again, a frantic follow-up to my silence. "Don't bother begging. Melissa and I leave tomorrow. I'll send for my things later." Melissa. The name tasted like ash. She was the new receptionist at his office, a girl I'd met at the company Christmas party, who seemed to vibrate with a mix of ambition and profound insecurity. I'd watched her laugh just a little too loudly at Mark's mediocre jokes, noticing how she'd graze his arm with her fingertips when she thought the room was looking elsewhere. She was young enough to be his daughter and naive enough to believe she was the soulmate who had finally awakened the lion inside a middle manager in a midlife crisis. She thought she was special, but to me, she was just the catalyst I needed to finally stop pretending. I didn't respond to his text. Instead, I scrolled past his name and called my lawyer, Sarah, whom I'd put on retainer 2 months ago after finding the first hotel charge on our shared credit card. "It's time," I said, my voice sounding hollow but steady in the empty boutique. "He just made his move." "The papers are already drafted and ready to go," Sarah replied, her tone professional yet laced with a sisterly sort of steel. "I can file them first thing tomorrow morning. Do you want me to have him served the moment he lands in Miami?" "No," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face as I looked at my reflection in the boutique's floor-to-ceiling mirrors. "No rush. Let him think he's won first. Let him get comfortable in the sun before the clouds move in." Another text chimed in, a digital barb designed to twist the knife. "I know this must be hard for you. You're not getting any younger, after all. At least you have your little shop to keep you busy." I looked around at my little shop, the high-end boutique I had built from nothing but sweat and late nights, the business that generated nearly triple his annual salary, the sanctuary whose profits I had meticulously guarded. It was more than a shop, it was my sovereignty. I thought of the certified letters that would eventually greet him in Florida and the realization that would slowly dawn on him. He hadn't escaped a marriage. He had walked out of a fortress into a desert. I spent that evening in our house, or rather, my house. It was the Victorian property I had inherited from my grandmother, a sprawling, beautiful piece of real estate that I had kept strictly in my name despite Mark's repeated, manipulative suggestions over the years to add him to the deed for tax purposes. It was another lucky instinct, or perhaps just a subconscious survival mechanism, that had finally paid off. As I organized the final stack of paperwork Sarah would need, I stumbled upon our wedding album. Mark looked so different then, softer, kinder, before the rod of ego had turned him into a caricature. These days, he squeezed himself into designer shirts that fought against his softening middle and used slang that sounded ridiculous coming from a man of 45. He was chasing a ghost, and he had burned down his home to do it. My phone was a constant companion that night, buzzing with a string of texts from him that grew increasingly condescending as he drank whatever celebratory champagne they'd bought. "I've been planning this for months," he wrote. "Melissa understands me in ways you never could. You'll be fine, Claire. Maybe you'll find someone more your own age. I already told my family. They agree we grew apart. It's nobody's fault, really." I screenshotted every single one, the images sliding into my evidence folder like bullets into a magazine. I wanted him to keep talking. I wanted him to document his own premeditation, his own gleeful admission of financial abandonment. He was digging a hole so deep he'd never see the sky again, and he was doing it with a smile on his face. The final text before I went to bed was the masterpiece. "By the way, I used the joint card to book our first-class flights and the hotel. Consider it my parting gift. LOL. Perfect," I whispered to the empty room. I picked up the phone and dialed the 24-hour customer service line for the credit card company. "Mrs. Harrison speaking," I said when the representative picked up. "I need to report fraudulent charges and cancel my primary card immediately." "Of course, ma'am. Can you identify the suspicious activity?" "There are 2 first-class tickets to Miami booked today, along with several high-end hotel charges at the Royal Palm. I also need to remove my husband as an authorized user effective immediately." "Do you have documentation that these charges were unauthorized, Mrs. Harrison?" "I have text messages from my husband admitting he used our joint card to book travel for himself and a third party after emptying our shared bank account. I'm happy to forward the screenshots to your fraud department right now." The representative's professional veneer softened just a fraction, a hint of human satisfaction bleeding into her voice. "We can certainly take care of that for you, ma'am. Consider those charges disputed and the card deactivated." I hung up, knowing that Mark and Melissa would arrive at the airport tomorrow morning, ready to begin their glamorous new life, only to find their tickets invalidated and their hotel reservations vanished into thin air. He thought he was leaving me with nothing. He didn't realize he was traveling into a void. The next morning, the sun rose over a world that felt fundamentally different. I woke up early, made a pot of expensive coffee, and watched the light hit the garden. My phone, which I'd silenced, was already a graveyard of missed calls and frantic messages. What the heck did you do to our credit card? The first one read, sent at 6 a.m. The airline won't honor our tickets. The hotel canceled our reservation. Answer me. I didn't answer. I dressed in my best power suit, a sharp, charcoal-colored number that made me feel like a blade, and headed to the boutique. Friday was always our busiest day, and I had a new shipment of Italian leather handbags to unpack. Life, I realized, doesn't stop just because a man decides to ruin himself. As I worked, the adrenaline of the previous night began to fade, replaced by a deep, resonant sense of purpose. Around noon, the heavy artillery started. Mark's mother, Barbara, called. I put her on speakerphone while I meticulously arranged a window display of autumnal knits. Claire, dear, she started, her voice trembling with that specific brand of manufactured disappointment. Mark told us everything. About how controlling you've been, how you practically drove him into the arms of someone else just to find some peace. He says you're being vindictive now, sabotaging his travel plans out of spite. Barbara, I said, my voice calm as a still lake. Did Mark mention that he emptied our joint account of every penny of our shared savings before he left? Did he tell you he tried to charge thousands of dollars in luxury travel for his 20-year-old girlfriend to my business-backed credit line? There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Well, she stammered. He said you left him no choice. That you'd been cold and distant for years. I have the texts, Barbara. Would you like me to read them to you? The one where he brags about taking our money? Or maybe the one where he mocks my age and tells me I'm not getting any younger. I've always liked you, but if you're calling to defend financial fraud and infidelity, I think it's best we end this conversation. My lawyer has advised minimal contact with Mark's family. Proceedings? Barbara squeaked. Already? Goodbye, Barbara. By late afternoon, the ripples of the explosion were spreading. Mark's sister, Amanda, was busy spreading the official version of the story to mutual friends, but the narrative was already crumbling. Word got back to me that Mark and Melissa were currently stuck at a budget motel near the airport, their Miami dreams temporarily derailed because Mark's personal credit cards, the ones he'd been using to wine and dine his receptionist, were maxed out to the limit. He was a man who had built a house of cards and was now shocked that a stiff breeze had knocked it over. Sarah called me with an update just as I was closing the shop for the evening. The emergency hearing is set for Monday. Given the documented text where he admits to emptying the account and the credit card fraud, we're in a position to freeze every asset he has left. Has he been served? Not yet, I said, walking out into the cool evening air. But he's at a motel near the airport. I'll send you the address. Perfect, Sarah said. Oh, and Claire? His girlfriend's social media is a goldmine. She's been posting about their great escape all day, including some very choice, very derogatory comments about you and your failing shop. It's going to look wonderful in front of a judge. I smiled. Let them post. Let them talk. While they were busy playing at a romance that was already curdling under the stress of a maxed-out visa, I was building a future that didn't have room for ghosts. Monday morning arrived with the kind of overcast sky that felt appropriately cinematic. I walked into the courthouse with Sarah by my side, feeling more like a spectator at a play than a participant in a tragedy. Mark was already there, pacing the hallway. He had opted for his new look, designer jeans that were slightly too tight for a man of his build, and a blazer that screamed midlife crisis. Melissa was perched on a bench nearby, her youth painfully obvious under the flickering fluorescent lights of the corridor. She looked less like a romantic lead and more like a confused kid who had wandered into the wrong room. When we entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. Mark's lawyer, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, attempted to frame the narrative early. Your Honor, he began, my client admits to some rash decisions. However, Mrs. Harrison's actions have been calculated and vindictive. She has intentionally stranded my client and attempted to alienate him from his own finances. Calculating. Sarah countered, her voice ringing through the room. I believe the word you're looking for is prudent. My client protected her separate assets and maintained detailed records of her husband's suspicious and fraudulent behavior. That isn't vindictive, Your Honor. That is smart business. Sarah began laying out the evidence with the precision of a surgeon. She presented the bank statements showing the exact moment Mark had drained the joint account. She presented the screenshots of the texts where he bragged about it. She showed the judge the credit card statements and the parting gift text. With every piece of paper, Mark seemed to shrink in his chair. The judge, a formidable woman with eyes that had seen every lie in the book, turned her gaze toward Mark. Mr. Harrison, she said, her voice dropping an octave. You admitted, in writing, to deliberately emptying a joint account and using shared credit cards to fund a luxury trip with a third party. Do you deny this? Mark shifted uncomfortably, tugging at the collar of his tight shirt. I was just trying to make a clean break, Your Honor. I thought, by committing financial fraud, the judge interrupted. And now you're claiming rights to a business and a home that documentation clearly shows are separate marital assets? The boutique grew during our marriage. Mark's lawyer tried, his voice lacking conviction. My client is entitled to the appreciation of that value. The business was established before the marriage, Sarah shot back. And Mrs. Harrison maintained a strict, documented separation of business and personal finances for 15 years. We have every penny accounted for. Mr. Harrison, on the other hand, referred to the business as a little shop and a hobby in his own communications. I watched Mark's face as the reality finally took hold. He had spent years underestimating me, mocking my obsessive bookkeeping and my little hobby, never realizing that the very things he ridiculed were the walls I was building to keep myself safe. He had thought he could just walk away with the prize money, never understanding that he'd never actually played the game. The court finds sufficient evidence of egregious financial misconduct, the judge announced, her gavel poised. All shared assets are frozen effective immediately. Mr. Harrison is ordered to return the full amount removed from the joint accounts within 24 hours. But that money is gone. Mark blurted out, his face reddening. We spent it on the tickets and the down payment for the Miami. Then I suggest you find a way to replace it, the judge snapped. And Mr. Harrison, this court takes a very dim view of using marital funds to finance adventures outside of the marriage. We will see you back here for the final dissolution. As we walked out of the courtroom, the silence in the hallway was heavy. I could hear Melissa in the distance, her voice high and panicked, asking Mark about their Miami plans. His response was a low, angry mumble that I didn't care to catch. I walked past them, the rhythmic click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown to his irrelevance. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in desperation. Mark, now realizing he was essentially broke and facing a legal mountain, tried every manipulation tactic in the book. He sent long, rambling emails claiming the boutique had been his idea, that he remembered investing in the early days, claims my meticulous ledgers easily debunked. He tried to play the victim to our mutual friends, but the love-struck narrative had been replaced by the fraudulent husband reality. He's staying at her studio apartment now, Sarah told me during an update call, a hint of amusement in her voice. Apparently, living on a receptionist's salary in a room the size of a walk-in closet isn't the glamorous Miami life he promised her. Melissa has been posting some very interesting things lately about toxic men and learning her lesson. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I would remember the text message. I would remember him telling me I wasn't getting any younger while he tried to steal the roof over my head. Instead of pity, I felt a burgeoning sense of pride. I had survived the worst thing he could do to me, and I had done it without losing a single night of sleep. The final divorce hearing was a grim affair for Mark. The cocky, tan, new version of him was gone, replaced by a man who looked every bit his 45 years. He was wearing his old clothes again. The designer wardrobe had apparently been returned to help cover the legal fees and the money he owed back to the joint account. Melissa was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she had moved on to a guy in his 20s who actually had a working credit card. As the judge finalized the settlement, which left me with my house, my business, and my dignity, Mark leaned over the table. "You destroyed me," he hissed, his eyes dark with resentment. "You planned this. You knew exactly what you were doing." "No, Mark," I said, looking him dead in the eye for the first time in months. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure you couldn't take me down with you." Outside the courthouse, his mother was waiting in her old sedan to take him back to his childhood bedroom. The man who had mocked my age was now a 45-year-old moving back in with his parents. As I watched them drive away, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a text from a ghost. It was a notification from my boutique's website, a new order for a high-end coat, the largest sale of the month. I looked up at the sky, the sun finally breaking through the clouds. My life wasn't over. It was finally, for the first time in 15 years, entirely mine. And as I walked toward my car, I realized that the little shop wasn't just keeping me busy, it was building an empire. Gemini said the aftermath of a wildfire is never just ash. It is a strange, fertile silence where the ground finally has room to breathe again. In the months following the final signature on our divorce papers, that silence became my sanctuary, a space where the ghost of Mark's condescension no longer rattled the windows. I found myself waking up at 5 a.m., not out of anxiety, but out of an electric sort of anticipation. I would sit on my grandmother's porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the fog roll off the garden, and realize that for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't bracing for an impact. There was no one to tell. My dreams were cute, no one to roll their eyes when I stayed late to balance the ledgers, and certainly no one to surreptitiously drain the lifeblood out of my bank account. My boutique, the Silver Thread, had become more than a retail space, it had become a statement of survival. I decided to lean into the momentum. I took a calculated risk and signed the lease on a second location in the historic district 2 towns over, a beautiful corner space with original hardwood floors and soaring ceilings that Mark would have definitely called overpriced ego-stroking. To me, it was the next brick in my fortress. The irony was delicious. While Mark was likely arguing with his mother about whose turn it was to do the laundry in their shared house, I was interviewing architects. I spent my afternoons looking at swatches of velvet and brass fixtures, feeling a sense of agency so profound it was almost intoxicating. News of Mark's new life reached me in fragmented, pathetic bursts, mostly through the local grapevine, which had turned his downfall into a cautionary tale for the ages. It turns out that when you build a relationship on a foundation of stolen money and midlife delusions, it tends to crumble the moment the first bill comes due. Without my income to subsidize his cool older guy persona, Mark had become an anchor that Melissa couldn't wait to cut loose. The first real crack in their facade happened only weeks after the court froze the assets. Apparently, Mark had tried to convince Melissa to take out a high-interest personal loan to fund their Miami dream, promising her that he would pay her back tenfold once he won his legal battle against his vindictive ex-wife. Melissa, for all her youthful naivety, wasn't entirely a fool. She had seen the way the judge looked at him. She had seen the cold, hard numbers. She realized that she wasn't the co-pilot of a getaway car, she was a passenger on a sinking ship. The Miami dream ended in a budget motel shouting match that was overheard by half the guests. Mark had blamed her for distracting him from his financial planning, and she had countered by pointing out that he was a 45-year-old man who couldn't even afford a rental car in his own name. She left him there, taking an Uber back to her parents' house and blocking his number before the car even hit the highway. Mark was left alone in a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and regret, with nothing but a suitcase full of tight shirts and a mounting pile of legal fees. I was in the middle of unpacking a crate of hand-blown glass perfume bottles when his sister, Amanda, walked into the shop. I hadn't seen her since the day of the first hearing. She looked exhausted, the lines around her mouth etched deep with the stress of a family in freefall. She stood by the counter for a long time, nervously fingering a lace camisole, before she finally looked up at me. I didn't come here to ask for anything, Claire, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed to see you. To see that you're okay. I'm more than okay, Amanda, I replied, setting a bottle down with a soft clink. I'm thriving. She nodded slowly, a tear tracing a path through her foundation. We had no idea. He told us such lies. He made you out to be this monster who was stifling his soul, who was hiding money from him, who made him feel like a prisoner. And we believed him because he's our brother, and we wanted to believe he was still the person we grew up with. But watching him these last few months, the way he talks about you, the way he refuses to take an ounce of responsibility for what he did, it's been a wake-up call. My mother is heartbroken. She's essentially a live-in maid for a man-child who spends his days scouring dating apps and complaining about the system. I felt a flicker of sympathy for Barbara, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her calling me vindictive on the phone. He chose his path, Amanda. He thought he was trading up for a life without consequences. He just didn't realize that I was the one holding the consequences at bay for 15 years. He's tried to sue for a hardship revision of the settlement, Amanda said, shaking her head. His lawyer told him it's a waste of time, but he's convinced that if he can just get a judge to listen to the truth, he'll get a piece of the boutique. He's obsessed with it. He calls it his success story that you stole. I actually laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh, but one of genuine, dark amusement. Let him try. My books are cleaner than a surgical suite. Every cent that went into this business was mine, earned by my hands, protected by my foresight. If he wants to spend his remaining few dollars on filing fees for a losing battle, that's his prerogative. It's just another hole he's digging for himself. Amanda left shortly after, buying a small candle as a peace offering. I watched her go, realizing that the bridge back to that family wasn't just burned, it had been dismantled and they would use to build something new. As the first anniversary of the Great Exit approached, I decided to host a private event at the boutique, a New Beginnings gala for my most loyal clients. I wanted to celebrate the fact that the Silver Thread was now a 2-location powerhouse with a burgeoning online presence. The night was a blur of champagne, laughter, and the kind of genuine support that makes you realize how much people actually see when they're looking at your life. Women I had known for years pulled me aside to whisper their own stories of resilience, of silent battles fought behind closed doors, and of the inspiration they took from seeing me stand tall. Then, the bell above the door chimed, cutting through the jazz music. The room didn't go silent, but a pocket of quiet rippled out from the entrance. I turned, expecting a late guest, but instead found myself looking at Melissa. She wasn't wearing the heavy makeup or the club clothes I remembered from the Christmas party. She looked younger, more tired, and deeply out of place in a room full of established, successful women. She stood by the door, clutching her purse, her eyes darting around until they landed on me. I walked toward her, my heart rate steady. I wasn't afraid of her. She was just a girl who had been used as a pawn in a man's mediocre game. I shouldn't be here, she said the moment I was within earshot. Probably not, I agreed. But you are. Is there something you need, Melissa? I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for the affair, I mean, yes, for that too, but for believing him when he said you were the reason he was unhappy. He's a hollow person, Claire. He spends his life looking for someone to fill the gaps in his own character, and when they can't do it, he punishes them for it. He tried to do it to me too. He tried to make me feel small so he could feel big. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the ghost of the woman I might have become if I hadn't been so meticulously careful. He didn't make you feel small, Melissa. He showed you who he was. The fact that you left means you're smarter than he gave you credit for. He's still telling people he's going to get the shop, she whispered. He has a folder of evidence he's building. He stalks your social media. It's not healthy. I know, I said, a cold hardness settling in my chest. But here's the thing about evidence built on lies. It dissolves under the light. He can spend the rest of his life staring at my success through a screen. It won't change the fact that I'm the one standing in the room, and he's the one outside looking in. She stayed for maybe 5 minutes, an awkward, blinking witness to the life she had briefly tried to dismantle. When she left, I didn't feel angry. I felt a profound sense of closure. She was the last loose end, the final piece of the wreckage. The next morning, my lawyer called. Mark filed the petition, Sarah said, her voice sounding bored, claiming undue influence and fraudulent concealment of marital assets. During the original mediation, he's asking for a 50% stake in the second location and a retroactive buyout of the first. And? I asked, sipping my coffee. And the judge dismissed it without a hearing. In fact, she's sanctioned his lawyer for filing a frivolous motion and ordered Mark to pay your legal fees for the response. He's essentially reached the end of the road, Claire. There are no more moves for him to make. I hung up the phone and looked out at my garden. The sun was high and bright, illuminating every flower, every leaf, every detail of the world I had fought to keep. I thought about the text message that started it all, the one that was supposed to be my ending. Mark had thought he was writing a tragedy starring a broken woman. He didn't realize he was just the prologue to a masterpiece. I picked up a pen and started drafting the plans for the third location. This one would be in the city, bigger and bolder than anything I'd done before. I wasn't just keeping busy in my old age. I was just getting started. The 3-year anniversary of the divorce arrived not with a whimper, but with the triumphant roar of a standing ovation as I took the stage at the Regional Entrepreneurship Awards. I wore a gown from my own boutique, a shimmering midnight blue silk that felt like a second skin, a suit of armor for the woman I had become. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I didn't see a victim, I saw a titan. The little shop had expanded into a regional empire of 5 locations, a flagship online store, and a consultancy firm that helped women protect their business interests. Mark's attempt to erase my value had, in the most delicious irony of fate, become the very catalyst that forced me to prove my worth to the world. Through the grapevine, the final chapter of Mark's descent had reached its inevitable, gritty conclusion. He had moved out of his parents' house, but not into the penthouse he had once promised Melissa. Instead, he was living in a cramped studio apartment above a noisy garage, working a desk job at a firm where he was the oldest person on the floor by a decade. His designer life was a memory, replaced by the crushing reality of alimony-driven debt and the social isolation that comes from being the man who tried to steal from his own wife. I heard he still frequented the local bars, telling anyone who would listen about the business he helped build, but the town had moved on. He was a ghost story people told to remind themselves why transparency matters. One rainy Tuesday, a package arrived at my flagship store with no return address. Inside was a tattered wedding album and a brief, handwritten note that simply said, "I'm sorry I didn't see who you were." I didn't cry. I didn't feel a surge of vindication. I simply walked to the break room and placed the album in the recycling bin. The past was a foreign country, and I no longer held a passport. My phone buzzed on the counter, not with a threat, but with a message from my manager about our record-breaking quarterly projections. I looked at the framed screenshot on my office wall, the one of his final, arrogant text from years ago. It served as a reminder that the loudest voices often have the weakest foundations. I had built my life on the solid ground of integrity, hard work, and the quiet brilliance of being underestimated. As I stepped out into the showroom, greeting my staff and the customers who looked to me as a leader, I realized that Mark hadn't just given me a divorce, he had given me my freedom. The story didn't end with a goodbye via text. It began with the moment I decided that I was enough. I am Claire, and I am finally, beautifully, and powerfully whole. Subscribe for daily Reddit stories. Take care. Also leave a comment. Thanks for watching.